Good afternoon and welcome to the ACNC's very first webinar. Our presenter today is Stuart Donaldson, the ACNC's Compliance Director. Hi Stuart.
Hi Susan.
And I'm Susan Quinn. I'm a Senior Policy and Education Officer at the ACNC and I'll be moderating today's session. This session aims to help you know what the ACNC's governance standards are and how they apply. We'll run through some ways that you can show how your charity complies with the governance standards, and we'll let you know where to get more assistance. We'll also consider some examples taken from a range of real cases that demonstrate some of the issues charities have in meeting the standards. You can ask us a question or make a comment at any time in the panel on the right of your screen. The comments and questions can only be seen by Stuart and I. If you have any difficulties with the sound on your computer, please try calling the phone number listed in that panel as well. If there are any questions we can't get to today, we'll provide answers later. And a recording of this webinar will also be available on the ACNC's YouTube channel. Finally, as this is our first webinar, we value any suggestions you have to improve these webinars in the future. So please pass on your suggestions in the survey you'll see at the end of this session. So this session will run for approximately an hour. First, we're going to talk about each of the governance standards and what they require. This will include some lessons from cases that the ACNC compliance team has dealt with. Then after we've run through the governance standards, we'll address some common myths about them. We'll then obviously answer any of your questions, so please keep those coming at any time throughout this session. At the end of the session, we'll let you know where you can find out more about the governance standards and how to meet them. So I'll hand over to Stuart now to begin.
Okay, great. Thanks, Susan. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. If you can't, write a note on the comment side and let us know. I've been working with the Charities Commission now for about 2.5 years, and I've been the Director of Compliance for the last year or so. In the last year, we completed about 50 investigations and compliance reviews. And when we found an issue, usually it involved a poor governance in some way or another. So it's really good that you can join us today and hear me talk about governance, and I hope you all get something from the presentation. So just starting off with what is governance. There's no specific definition of governance in our legislation, but a common definition is what you can see on the screen. So governance is about the practices and procedures that ensure an organisation pursues its objectives effectively and transparently. So governance is actually about a range of things. It covers how you manage your affairs, how you manage public money and donations, how you manage your volunteer time, how you manage your risks, and how you demonstrate that you're operating transparently and for a proper purpose. Good governance can be achieved in many ways, and we'll give you examples of that throughout this session. So it can include simple things like holding meetings to make sure that the views of your members are heard, setting a strategy, and monitoring the work of an organisation to make sure that it aligns with that strategy, and documenting roles and responsibilities within an organisation. The governance standards in our legislation do set a minimum standard of governance, so you can do much more than what we're covering today. So what we're covering today isn't a complete prescription of best practice. You can do more. So looking at the next slide, the governance standards. So there are actually 5 governance standards, and this is just a quick overview of those standards. Charities must meet these standards to register as a charity with the ACNC and to remain registered. There are 5 standards, you can see them there, and I'll just quickly run through them, but we'll go through them in more detail soon. So firstly, purposes and not-for-profit character. Charities must be able to demonstrate that their purposes and character are not for profit, that they work towards their charitable purposes, and that they provide information about their purposes to the public. The second standard, accountability to members. Charities must take reasonable steps to be accountable to their members and provide them with adequate opportunities to raise concerns about how the charity is governed. The third standard, charities must not commit a serious offence under Australian law. and I'll cover more detail about that soon. The fourth standard, charities must take reasonable steps to ensure that its responsible persons, and when I talk about responsible persons today, I mean board members, committee members and trustees, the people responsible for governance, are not disqualified from managing a corporation or being a responsible or disqualified from being a responsible person of a registered charity. Finally, under Governance Standard 5, there are actually 7 duties set out for responsible persons, and we'll cover those 7 duties soon. As Susan said, I will speak about some examples that we've seen over the last 2.5 years. The examples that I'll talk about today are a combination of what we've seen, so there's no example here which actually represents an actual example. It's a hybrid or a combination of some of the cases that we've looked at. Just before I go on to the next slide, I just wanted to clarify a couple of more things. Firstly, I said that the governance standards apply to all charities. Actually, there is an exception, and basic religious charities do not have to comply with our governance standards. If you want me to go into more detail about basic religious charities, let me know on your comments and I'll cover it later on. About 10% of our charities fall under the definition of basic religious charities, and so there's quite a lot of criteria a religious charity has to meet to fall within that definition. I'd also like to note that our governance standards are in addition to other requirements that your charity might have. So if you're an incorporated association, you might have other requirements that you have to meet according to your state. But if you're a corporation under ACNC, then those requirements have been switched off. I'll cover more of that later on. So let's look in detail at the standards now, starting with Governance Standard 1, which is the Purpose and Not-for-Profit Character Standard. So as you can see there, registered charities must demonstrate that their purposes and character as not-for-profit, comply with their purposes and character as a not-for-profit, and provide information about their charitable purpose to the public. If you're a charity, you have to be a not-for-profit. So what's a not-for-profit? It's an organisation that does not operate for the profit, personal gain, or other benefit of particular people. So for example, it cannot operate for the benefit of its members or the people that run it or their friends or relatives. And that's a common issue that we look at on compliance. Charities that actually are not just focused on public good, but charities that might be providing significant private benefits to the people that run the charities. So, firstly, your purposes and character may be demonstrated in your governing documents. So that's the way to meet, one way to meet the first part of the standard. So, for example, if the purpose of relieving poverty is your purpose and it's stated in your governing documents, that would satisfy the relevant part of the standard. Some charities may not have conventional governing documents, so you have to demonstrate your purpose and character through other means. Secondly, you must show that you are complying with your not-for-profit purposes. The steps you must take to comply with the standard depends on factors such as your size and the extent to which you receive donations, grants and money from the public. For example, if you collect donations, the ACNC would expect you to have accounting systems in place to ensure the money is directed at your charitable purposes. If your charity is making payments to responsible persons or their associates for services, the ACNC would expect you to be able to show that the payments are at arm's length and are not excessive. If you are transferring, for example, specific amounts of money overseas, you might do this to provide humanitarian aid, you must demonstrate your assistance was delivered as intended for your not-for-profit purposes and not diverted for purposes such as private benefit or at the extreme to fund terrorist activities. Finally, you must make information available about your purposes to the public. This year, in the 2014 financial year, the ACNC has required all charities to provide us with your governing documents along with your annual information statement for 2014. We'll publish those, so that is a way of satisfying this particular standard. So on the next slide, I just want you to take you through a really simple case study that links to this standard. So in this case study, it's an example where we had a medium-sized charity. It was fundraising in multiple states. We got involved because the charity did not appear to be conducting significant charitable activities, but it was making large payments to responsible persons and their associates. During that investigation, we found that the charity did not comply with its purposes and character as a not-for-profit. The lesson from this case is that if a charity does pay its responsible persons or associates, it must be able to show that these payments are at arm's length and not excessive. And this is so that we can be confident that you have a solely charitable purpose and that you are complying with your purposes and character as a not-for-profit. So the consequences of not being able to do so, they can be serious, and ultimately they can result in us revoking the registration of a charity. So that's one case study linked to Governance Standard 1. Let's look at Governance Standard 2 now. Governance Standard 2 requires registered charities to take reasonable steps to be accountable to members and to allow members adequate opportunities to ask questions and raise concerns about how the charity is run. At the ACNC, we received about 1,300 complaints from the public in the last 2.5 years, and a number of those complaints relate to this standard and come from members. I want to point out that this standard only applies to charities that have members, for example, incorporated associations and companies limited by guarantee. This, out of the 5 standards, does not apply if you do not have members. So it is quite limited in its application. So for example, it does not apply to charitable trusts. If a charity is already meeting the requirements of incorporated associations legislation in their state or territory, then you're going to be complying with the standard. If your charity is a company registered under the Corporations Act 2001 and it met the requirements under that Act and continues to do so, it would be complying with the standard. But one thing I'd point out about that is because the Corporations Act obligations for registered charities are switched off, this standard increases your flexibility in terms of being accountable for members. So it puts responsibility onto you to decide how to be best accountable to members. So for example, corporate charities no longer have to hold annual general meetings, which you were required to under the Corporations Act. However, obviously you may still decide to hold annual general meetings to comply with this standard, or you might want to continue holding annual general meetings because it might be a requirement in your governing documents to do so. But you do have more flexibility as an ACNC registered charity than you did before the ACNC came into being. The next slide is just an example about governance. The next slide takes you through some tips about how you can show that you're accountable to members. And these are just examples. So you have to decide what is best for your charity. So you can hold annual general meetings. You can provide notices of member meetings. You can require a quorum to be met at a member meeting. You can allow members to ask for questions at meetings. You can provide for elections for responsible persons. You can provide members with an annual report, including financial information and achievements towards its purpose. So that's what you could do, but it's up to you to make that decision, and it's not prescribed in our legislation. So that's important to remember. Okay, that's Governance Standard 2. Let's follow that up with a case study. So the case study is where a charity was supporting a centre for homeless people. Members were concerned about governance and control of the charity. The charity's website had been taken down by a former responsible person who had control of that website and resigned. After that, almost no information was made available to members. What actually was happening was the board was trying to fix the governance failures for that charity. But while they were trying to do that, they weren't holding regular meetings and they weren't providing members with regular information. And obviously the members were so frustrated they thought it was important to contact us in that situation. The lesson there is when a charity is undergoing change, it's important to continue to update your members and ensure that accurate information is available to those members. So you do have that ongoing obligation to be accountable to members even though you might be going through a difficult time or a time of change. Okay, Governance Standard 3, compliance with Australian laws. So this standard requires your charity not to act in a way that could be dealt with as an indictable offence under Australian law, which is usually punishable by imprisonment for a period exceeding 12 months, or a breach of law that has a civil penalty of 60 penalty units, which is $10,200 or more. The point about Governance Standard 3 is that it requires charities to give the public trust and confidence that the ongoing operations and assets of your charity are not put at risk through non-compliance with Australian laws. That's the purpose of this standard. One interesting thing about this standard is that your charity doesn't have to be actually charged with an offence or given a penalty for you to be in breach of this standard. So for example, if the ACNC reasonably believes that it is more likely than not that your charity has engaged in an offence, for example of fraud, the charity would be in breach of the standard. The ACNC therefore could take action. So for example, we might issue the charity with a formal warning without the need for a prosecution to have been completed. This allows us to protect the charity from potential ongoing misuse, while a referral is made perhaps to the police or another agency to take formal proceedings. I'll come back to this standard later on when we talk about the myths associated with our governance standards. Case study here links very much into what I was just talking about. So a charity was involved in providing support to vulnerable people. There were allegations that the charity had engaged in financial fraud. What we found was that the charity actually had committed a serious offence under Australian law. We liaised with the police, but we did not have to wait for charges to be laid before using our enforcement powers. So the lesson is that charities simply must not engage in conduct or omissions that could be dealt with as an indictable offence under Australian law or within those penalty provisions. Okay. Excuse me. Governance Standard 4. So this looks at the suitability of responsible persons. We've had a few examples, not too many under the standard. So registered charities must take reasonable steps to be satisfied that each of their responsible persons are not disqualified from managing a corporation or disqualified from being a responsible person by the ACNC within the previous 12 months. Okay, Governance Standard 4 is an interesting standard. We've had some examples, but not too many under this standard. Although the ACNC and ASIC can disqualify persons, and we will list these persons on our respective registers, persons can also be automatically disqualified from managing corporations. And if you're automatically disqualified, you're disqualified under this standard, but you don't actually appear on the ASIC list. So, for example, two examples of matters that will result in automatic disqualification are if a person is convicted of an offence in contravention of the Corporations Act, or of an offence involving dishonesty and is punishable by imprisonment of at least 3 months, or if the person is an undischarged bankrupt. So, if your responsible person is an undischarged bankrupt, it won't be listed anywhere by the ACNC or ASIC, but you have to know that, and as a result of them being an undischarged bankrupt, they cannot be a responsible person. Okay, so here's some tips on how to comply with the standard. So you can search the ASIC Disqualified Persons Register. I should have put up there that you can search our Disqualified Person Register as well, but at the moment the ACNC hasn't actually disqualified any persons, so there's no one on that register. So at the moment you don't have to check our register for that. Excuse me. The second point is a really useful tip, and that is that you can require all your responsible persons to sign a declaration when they get appointed that they are not disqualified, so you can explain what that is and get them to sign it, and get them to confirm that they will advise your charity if their circumstances change and they do become disqualified. Because it is quite possible you have a responsible person that meets the test for the first few years, but then for some reason they become an undischarged bankrupt, for example, and that will prevent them from being a responsible person. So they are two tips that could be useful. The case study, a charity was registered for over 10 years. Its charitable purposes weren't too clear to us when we looked at it. It hadn't filed its annual information statement. It turned out the charity only had one responsible person, and that person had been in prison for fraud and was still disqualified from managing a corporation. So, for example, they might have gone to prison, but that 5-year period hadn't a 5-year period hadn't ended from the time they were released from prison. The 5-year period is explained in the Corporations Act. So what we found was that the charity actually hadn't taken reasonable steps to ensure that its responsible persons were suitable. And the lesson there is that charities must ensure that their responsible persons are not disqualified from managing a corporation. In this example, if they had been imprisoned, the disqualification doesn't end until 5 years from the date of their release from prison. So it does continue on for quite a long period. Okay, so that's Governance Standard 4. Governance Standard 5. It sounds like it's a simple standard. It's actually quite a long standard, this one. So registered charities must take reasonable steps to make sure that 7 specific duties apply to their responsible persons and that they follow them. So Governance Standard 5 actually links to 7 specific duties. So let's look at those duties. The duties come from common law generally, so they tend to have well-established meanings. The first one, so the first duty involves consideration of the circumstances of the individual charity. So I'll read out each duty, and then I will give a bit of an explanation. And even these duties I've listed here are paraphrased. We've got more detail about the duties in a lot of our material. So firstly, the charity must ensure that the responsible persons exercise their powers and discharge their duties with the care and diligence of a reasonable person. This duty involves consideration of the circumstances of your individual charity. So a responsible person of a small charity may do things differently than what a responsible person of a medium or large charity will do. So it does take into account the circumstances of the charity. The second duty, responsible persons must act in good faith in the best interests of the charity and to further its charitable purposes. So under this second duty, if there is a conflict, the responsible person should always put the charity's interest first above their own. Thirdly, charities should not responsible persons should not misuse their position as a responsible person. So for this, number 3, and for number 4, which is that responsible persons must not misuse information they gain in their role as a responsible person. For both of these, an example would be that a charity may ensure that its staff employment contracts state that the employees must not use their position or the information gained in their position for private purposes. That's one way of doing it. The fifth duty, responsible persons must disclose perceived or actual material conflicts of interest, including related party transactions. So under this duty, a responsible person who has or may appear to have a material conflict of interest in a decision that is being made by the directors or the other responsible persons should tell the other responsible persons about it. So it's all about disclosing the conflict of interest. Once other directors or responsible persons are told about that interest, then they as a group can manage the risks associated. So let's have an example. If a responsible person, for example, makes a disclosure to directors that if the charity is looking to raise funds and that responsible person's daughter might be a daughter that is looking to tender for the job of raising funds for the charity, then that responsible person should disclose that their daughter is going to be involved with that tender, and then the board or the governing persons can make a decision whether that director should be involved with the decision of approving the tenders or not, because there is a conflict of interest because their daughter is involved. So that's one example. But there are many examples of conflicts of interest, and we've got that in much of our material. The sixth point is that charities responsible persons must ensure that the financial affairs of a charity are managed responsibly. So that is not meant to discourage responsible persons from being innovative or taking risks where appropriate, but it is reflecting that it is reasonable to expect appropriate financial systems and procedures are put in place for a charity. Simple things, for example, ensuring that cheques have 2 signatures. So that does fall as a duty of a responsible person to make sure those affairs are managed properly. And finally, for the 7th duty, responsible persons should not allow the charity to operate whilst insolvent. And insolvency is a defined term. It's defined in the Corporations Act 2001. So quite a list of duties of responsible persons that all those responsible persons that you have for your charity should be aware of. So what could you do to help with compliance with the standard? You could raise awareness of these duties through providing a letter of appointment or other information for your responsible persons. You could provide regular information or training to your responsible persons about their duties. You could take action if your responsible persons are not carrying out their duties. So yeah, 3 pretty obvious things, hopefully. Let's look at a case study. So you've got a charity that operated nationally via an online presence. The charity was closely held. Charitable funds were alleged to have been lent interest-free to the responsible persons for private purposes. So what we found was that the responsible persons were using charitable funds privately. The charity had failed to ensure that the responsible persons had acted in good faith and in the best interest of the charity, and it had failed to ensure that they weren't misusing their position. So the lesson there is that a charity must take steps to ensure that its responsible persons aren't just aware of their duties, but they actually meet their duties. Okay. Excuse me. So finally, I'd like to end on this, which is myths about governance standards. And we have published some detail behind these 7 myths on our register, so they're worth looking at. And they might address some of the questions that you have. So firstly, there's a myth that you need to change your governing documents to meet the standards. The answer to that is probably not. Most charities are already likely to have clauses in relation to their not-for-profit nature and their purpose and meeting requirements in their governing documents, and they will already meet the governing standards. So the answer to that is probably not. Your governing documents are probably fine. Secondly, there's a myth that you need to get professional advice on how to meet the standards. The answer to that is that these are minimal standards, and we do expect charities will meet these standards. You certainly can get advice on how to meet the standards, but you don't have to. And we've published a lot of material on our website to help you understand the standards. So you don't need to get professional advice. It's an option, but you don't need to. The third point is that the governance standards require you to comply with every law in Australia. No, that's not right. Hopefully you picked up from what I've mentioned earlier that Governance Standard 3 does not require your charity to send us evidence that you're complying with every law or to comply with every law. There is a threshold that you have to comply with, as I've already covered. So that is not a requirement of Governance Standard 3. The fourth myth is that the governance standards say that, oops, sorry, I've missed one there. I suppose it links to number 3, doesn't it? There's the myth that you can't break any law. So you don't have to confirm with us that you've met the laws, and you don't have to comply with every law because of that threshold. So sorry, the third and the fourth bullet point relate to each other. The next bullet point, the myth, because of the introduction of the governance standards, charities will have to meet the requirements of both the ACNC and ASIC. So no, that is definitely a myth. The governance standards are not intended to duplicate the obligations under the Corporations Act. ASIC obligations have actually been switched off from the time the governance standards applied. So you do not have to comply with both. There is no duplication there. And as I've already alluded to, some of our governance standards are a bit different to what was required under ASIC and allow you to have more flexibility. The next myth, we're a religious charity, so the governance standards won't apply to us. That is a myth because the governance standards only don't apply to basic religious charities, so you have to fall within a much narrower definition. So approximately a quarter to a third of our charities are religious charities, but only 10% of total charities fall under the definition of a basic religious charity. So if you're a religious charity, don't assume they don't apply to you. You have to actually assess yourself correctly as a basic religious charity, and only then will they not apply to you. Last but not least, each of our charities' responsible persons now have legal obligations under the governance standards. That is a myth as well, because it is actually the charity that has responsibility for meeting the governance standards, not the individual members of the charity's governing body. So while Governance Standard 5 and 4 actually relate directly to responsible persons, the obligation applies to the charity itself to take reasonable steps to ensure that the responsible persons meet the requirements. So those responsibilities always fall back on the charity. So those are some of the myths that have been raised over the last 2.5 years that we have tried to address on our website, and maybe there are more myths that you're going to raise shortly in some of your questions. So that's myths, and I think we're up to the question stage, so I'll hand you back to Susan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart, for that. Hopefully that's given a clearer idea of what the governance standards are and what charities need to do or not do in order to meet them. We're now happy to take your questions. Thank you to everybody who sent through their questions throughout the presentation. I might pose one to you first, Stuart. So you've let us know what the governance standards require, but what should a charity do if it knows that it's not meeting the governance standards?
Okay, thanks, Susan. That's a really good question. If a charity realises it's not meeting the governance standards, the first question you have to ask yourself is this a significant breach of the governance standards? Is it so significant that it might affect your organisation's charitable status with us? If it's a significant breach, then you're actually obliged under our legislation to let us know. And we have a form to do that. You should look at our site. So if it's so significant that there is major fraud happening, for example, you should let us know. And we will talk to you about that. We may be able to help you, give you educational guidance. We'll be able to liaise with you to see what you're going to do about the breach. So you do have to tell us. If it's not a significant breach, if it's a more minor breach, it's up to you. In fact, we've had some charities that have written to us and they've said, this isn't a major breach, but we're just letting you know that this has happened, and here's what we're doing about it. And from our perspective, it's good to know that. We were really impressed that the charities had let us know, but you don't have to do that. So it's all about a threshold. If it is significant, you must let us know. If it's not, you can let us know, or you can just focus on addressing that breach yourself.
Thanks, Stuart. We've had a couple of questions as well about basic religious charities. I was wondering if you could let us know a bit more about where and how they're exempt and what that means for basic religious charities.
Okay. Okay, that's great. So we've got a definition for basic religious charities in the legislation, and I'll run through some of that criteria in a second. If you are a basic religious charity, actually you're exempt from two things. You're exempt from complying with the governance standards, and you're exempt from providing any financial information to the ACNC. So you don't have to provide any financial information in your AIS, your annual information statement, and you don't have to provide us with financial reports. So it is very important that you do know if you're a basic religious charity or not. So the criteria is set down in our legislation, but effectively you cannot be a body corporate that's registered under the Corporations Act. That's a key criteria, and you can't be an incorporated association either. A lot of charities make that mistake. They think that they're entitled to be a basic religious charity, but if they're incorporated, they actually cannot be. They must just have a subtype of advancing religion, so you can't be involved with multiple purposes. You must just have the religious purpose. You can't be a DGR or have DGR status, deductible gift recipient status in your own right. You can have a fund that has DGR status, but if that's the case, there's limitations around that. I don't think you can receive more than $250,000 a year. So there are some specific requirements. But the mistake that most charities make is that they see themselves as a religious charity, and therefore they think they're pretty basic and they're a basic religious charity, but they're incorporated. And so they do make a mistake there. And we've got quite a lot of education happening at the moment, and we are contacting a number of charities who we think have made that mistake to ask them to reassess whether they're a basic religious charity or not.
Great. Thank you. We've had a couple of questions also about companies limited by guarantee. So I think it'd be good if we could clarify what those Corporations Act requirements being switched off actually means in terms of, do those charities still need to have AGMs, or should they still need to have AGMs even if there's not a requirement under that Act now?
So that is something I did refer to earlier on as well. So if you're a company limited by guarantee, almost all the requirements are switched off for you under the Corporations Act, and so our governance standards apply. But I would advise you to look at our website, because we've got a very good page which lists exactly what requirements have been switched off, and that website page also links you to the ASIC site, so you can see what's required there. There are a couple of things that aren't switched off, but I think really it's better for you to look at our site and look at that detail, because it is important for you to know. The other thing, of course, for you to remember is that if you're a charity that is a corporation that's now registered with us, if for any reason you're deregistered by us, so for example, if you don't file 2 years worth of annual information statements, the ACNC will deregister you, then you go back to being regulated by ASIC, and all the ASIC requirements then would be switched on, so you'd have to go back to holding annual general meetings and meeting all those requirements of ASIC.
Sure. I might add also that AGMs may be a requirement of your charity's governing documents, despite the government standards not actually requiring them, so you'd always need to check your constitutional rules for your charity just to make sure what the requirements are. The ACNC has developed and at the end of last year published a template constitution for companies limited by guarantee that are registered charities. We'd be happy to send you links to that information, as well as the information Stuart referred to that shows you when ASIC and the ACNC are relevant to you. Thanks, Stuart. We had a couple of questions about financial controls and financial literacy. So how financially literate do board members or committee members need to be, and how much of, I guess, the financial control elements are the responsibility of the board versus, say, the responsibility of employees of a charity?
No, thank you. That's a tough question. I mean, financial controls, let me see, what have I got here? I mean, in a way I've covered the fact that the board needs to satisfy itself that there are sufficient financial controls in place. So the board does need to ask, or the responsible persons do need to ask questions of management. They can't just assume that management are going to be doing the right thing. I think that's a key point to raise. There might be times when you should get advice. I mean, I think it's very dangerous if your responsible persons have no financial literacy, so you have to really think about where advice fits in terms of what you're going to do. You need to exercise your own judgment on that. Even under the ACNC legislation, there are financial requirements. Unless you're a basic religious charity, you have to file an annual information statement with us. You have to provide financial information to us, and the responsible persons have to sign off that annual information statement to declare that it is correct. So you're always going to have some financial literacy at that responsible person level.
Sure. Thanks, Stuart. We have a question also just about what the governance standards might require generally for smaller charities. So understandably larger charities with employees and large revenues will have more complex controls in place for finances, or they'll have more procedures in place in order to meet governance requirements. For smaller charities, what would we expect?
So that all comes back to your judgment. It's not prescribed. Our legislation says that what you put in place will be proportionate based on your size. So it's not unreasonable. It doesn't expect small charities to be doing exactly what large charities would do. But I hope that actually through that presentation and some of those examples, we've given you some good tips on what to think about to meet the standards. And some of them will be relevant for you, others won't be. Also, there's a really good publication, and I've heard a lot of good comments about it, that we published before the governance standards came in, and it's called Governance for Good. So if you have any questions about governance, look at our site, got a lot published. Have a look at the Governance for Good publication. Often we'll post that out to charities that are under investigation or review. And I've had personal feedback from charities who have been under investigation saying that green booklet that you gave us was really, really good, and we made a lot of changes as a result of what is in your booklet. So have a look at it if you have any governance standard queries. It is really useful.
Great. Thank you, Stuart. So that covers the questions we've got from you largely. We might now look at where you can get a bit more information. So you can keep in contact with the ACNC by various means. You can go to our website and sign up for the various updates that we put out, so the Commissioner's column, email updates, and there's also a quarterly update that goes out. We've had quite a few questions asking us to send links or let you know where particular guidance we've referred to today is mentioned. We're happy to do that. We've noted down the questions that have come through. So in a follow-up email to this webinar, we'll give you links to what we've spoken about today. You can also give the advice line a call or email them, and then we're on social media, so you can keep up to date that way. Oops, I'm sorry guys, I'll just go back to more information. So we do have a lot of specific information on governance and the governance standards. There's website guidance that we have at the moment. There's Governance for Good, which Stuart just referred to, that little green book. Our Compliance Directorate has also put together some more specific information on compliance. And Stuart, do you want to let people know what that information covers generally?
Yeah, it's a simple booklet actually, and it's called Your Charity and ACNC Compliance. I'm working with you to help your charity stay on track. It is a pamphlet, but you can go to our website and look at the content as well. It gives you an overview, if you're a charity, what to expect if our Compliance Directorate gets involved. So it talks about when we might contact you as a charity. As I said, we've received over 1,300 concerns from the public over the last 2.5 years, and concerns from the public are often one reason why we'll look into a charity and start to investigate, but it's not the only reason. The pamphlet covers what we consider before we take action, and it highlights that we will act firmly and quickly where there is evidence of serious mismanagement or serious misappropriation, or a serious and deliberate breach of the Act, or if vulnerable people or significant charitable assets are at risk. So it gives you that sort of flavour that when you get involved with our compliance team, it's only at that serious level. And we also give more explanations about what to do if you haven't met your obligations, and some of which I actually mentioned earlier about notifying us if you've had a serious breach of a governance standard. And it goes through what you can expect if you are being reviewed or investigated by us. But part of that pamphlet also has a simple checklist for you to self-assess your own compliance. And it really reflects what we've just talked about today as well. You have to think about 5 things. Are you working towards your charitable purpose? Are you using your profits and assets only for your charitable purpose? So making sure there's no private benefit whatsoever. Are you meeting your reporting obligations? So you're filing your annual information statement with us. You're notifying us if your responsible persons change or if your governing document changes. The 4th one is, are you meeting your record keeping obligations? So you must be able to explain and record your operations and your transactions to a certain standard, and you must keep them actually for at least 7 years. And the 5th point is whether you've met those 5 governance standards that I've just taught you through today.
Okay, excellent. So that's available on our website also. The myths that Stuart ran through earlier are all available on our website, along with the myth busting that Stuart provided us with.
And we'd like to improve and increase that list as well. So if as a result of this presentation today you've got any other questions that could be a myth that you've heard about that either I did clarify or that you want clarified, then let us know and we can keep adding to that list of myths about the governance standards.
Great, thank you. The conflicts of interest guidance is also on our website. We also have a range of templates up now that can help you meet some of the governance standard requirements. So for example, there are templates for notices of members' meetings, for meeting agendas and minutes. And there are also some documents there that you can use to ensure that your responsible persons are suitable, so some declarations that they can make. People have asked for the information on basic religious charities and companies limited by guarantee in particular. If you wanted to access the companies limited by guarantee information, you can go to acnc.gov.au/CLG, and the basic religious charities information again will be in the email we follow up with. You can also get in touch with us, as I said, through the advice line or through the team that I'm involved with, the education team. So that's our email address there if you have any further questions that are more specific to what we've talked about today.
And there aren't any final questions? Anyone?
No, let's see. We're going to check your questions as they're coming through. We really appreciate everything that you've sent through to us today.
I think the one thing I'd highlight is really what you said earlier on, Susan, which is that this is the first session, and I think when you close out of the session there'll be a survey, and if there's anything that you think we needed to clarify or add, or if you think there's anything new for this presentation for next time, then please let us know. If you didn't hear clearly or if there was just something that really annoyed you throughout this presentation, let us know in your feedback and we'll try and sort that out next time.
Yes. Thanks, Stuart. So we'll finish up there. Thank you again, Stuart, for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us and for all of the excellent questions that you sent through. As we mentioned, this is our first webinar, so there are more to come. In that exit survey, you can let us know if you'd like us to keep you up to date with the next ones. Thanks very much and have a good afternoon.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining.
Bye.